To understand how Reynhard Sinaga became Britain's most prolific predator, we have to go back to where it all began. At 24, Sinaga arrived in the UK under the guise of pursuing higher education. First, a master's degree in sociology, then another in international planning. To the outside world, he was just another student, a quiet, bookish academic living in Manchester's vibrant city centre. But Sinaga was never really here for the degrees. His real studies took place after dark. By day, he was the friendly, soft-spoken foreign student, harmless, almost awkward. He made friends easily. He attended church regularly. He even volunteered for LGBTQ+ groups in the city, known for his warm, inviting personality. But at night, he became something else entirely, a predator lurking in plain sight. Sinaga didn't fit the stereotype of a criminal. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't use force. Instead, he played the long game. He blended in, building trust, positioning himself as the safe option in the chaos of Manchester's nightlife. And when the opportunity arose, he struck. Manchester is a city that never sleeps, a city where music spills from every bar, where the drinks flow freely, and where the young and reckless embrace the night without fear. But for Sinaga, this wasn't just nightlife, it was a hunting ground. Sinaga had perfected his method. His victims were always the same, young men, usually drunk, often disoriented, separated from their friends. He would wait outside clubs, sometimes even inside, scanning the crowd for the perfect target. Then came the invitation. Always friendly, always helpful. He'd offer a place to charge a phone, a safe place to sober up before heading home, a cup of tea. No pressure, no threats, just a friendly face in the chaos of the night. But once they crossed the threshold of his apartment, they were no longer in control. From the outside, Sinaga's apartment looked like any other student flat, messy, cluttered, unremarkable. But what happened inside those walls was far from ordinary. Inside, police would later find hundreds of hours of footage, evidence that would turn this unassuming flat into a house of horrors. Sinaga didn't just assault his victims. He documented everything, every attack, every unconscious victim, every moment of control. He kept trophies, notes, detailed records of what he had done. It was as if he saw himself as invincible, untouchable, above the law. And for over a decade he was. For years, Reynhard Sinaga lived two lives: the friendly student, the unassuming academic, and the monster lurking beneath the surface. He believed he was untouchable. He believed he would never be caught. But on one fateful night, that all changed. For over a decade, Reynhard Sinaga's apartment had been a crime scene, a place where countless young men unknowingly became victims of Britain's most prolific predator. And yet, no one knew. He had perfected his method. He was careful. He was calculated. He had never made a mistake. Until one night, when one of his victims woke up. In the early hours of June 2nd, 2017, a 21-year-old man woke up to the unimaginable. His head was pounding, his body unresponsive, as if trapped under an invisible weight. And then, he saw him. Reynhard Sinaga was not expecting this. His victims never woke up. That was the plan. That was how he had avoided capture for so long. But on this night, something had gone wrong. Adrenaline surged through the young man's body. His instincts took over. Before Sinaga could react, the victim fought back. With the little strength he had, the victim managed to escape. He grabbed his phone, ran out of the apartment, and into the night. That call would change everything. By the time officers arrived at the scene, Sinaga was still inside his apartment. They found him on the floor, injured from the altercation. At first, it looked like a routine case of a fight between two men. But when officers confiscated Sinaga's phone, the horrifying truth began to unravel. What they found was beyond anything they had ever encountered before. Hundreds of videos, hours upon hours of footage, one victim after another, unconscious, unaware, completely at the mercy of a predator who had recorded every single attack. Sinaga hadn't just recorded his crimes, he had documented them. Detailed notes about each victim, personal trophies, a twisted archive of horror hidden in plain sight. The realization hit investigators like a wave of ice-cold water. This was not one victim, not two, not 10. This was something much, much bigger. Detectives working the case had no idea how many men had fallen victim. Many of them had no recollection of ever encountering Sinaga. Some had been completely unaware that they had ever been assaulted. I got a call from the police saying they found a video of me. I had no idea. I had no memory of ever meeting him. To think that someone had done that to me, and I had no clue, it's terrifying. Reynard Sinaga was arrested on June 3, 2017. He denied everything, but the evidence against him was undeniable. His own recordings, his own notes, his own twisted trophy collection would now be the key to locking him away forever. As investigators began identifying victims, the scale of Sinaga's crimes became clear. This was not a single case. This was a serial predator, unlike anything the UK had ever seen. Sinaga believed he was untouchable. He believed he was smarter than everyone else. But now the world knew his name, and soon he would face the consequences. Reynhard Sinaga had spent years orchestrating his crimes, believing he would never be caught. But now, for the first time, he was no longer in control. The man who once preyed on hundreds of victims now found himself facing justice in a court of law. Due to the sheer volume of evidence and victims involved, prosecutors divided the case into 4 separate trials, spanning from 2018 to 2020. This wasn't just a trial. This was a case unlike anything the UK legal system had ever seen before. Prosecutors described Sinaga as a depraved and perverted individual who took pleasure in preying on the vulnerable. But despite the overwhelming evidence, Sinaga showed no sign of guilt, no emotion, no regret. When confronted with the footage from his own devices, footage he himself recorded, Sinaga claimed that the victims had consented to the acts. He insisted that it was all just part of a game, a fantasy where the many drugged and assaulted were pretending to be unconscious. Detective's voice from real interview. It was absurd. He was completely delusional. He genuinely believed he was untouchable. One by one, survivors came forward, their voices trembling but unwavering as they recounted the horror of discovering they had been victims. Victim 1, I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea. To be told by the police that I had been assaulted in such a way, and to see video evidence of it. I can't even explain what that does to you. Victim 2 explained, I trusted him. He was friendly, harmless, I thought. But all along, he was planning this. That's what sickens me the most. Victim 3 said, he stole years of my life. He took away my ability to trust, my sense of security. No prison sentence will ever change that. With each testimony, the weight of Sinaga's crimes became heavier. The jury sat in stunned silence. Even seasoned prosecutors admitted that the scale of the case was overwhelming. The prosecutor said, never before in British criminal history have we seen a predator of this scale. Reynard Sinaga is not just a danger to his victims, he is a danger to society. On January 6, 2020, Reynard Sinaga stood before the judge to receive his fate. His expression remained blank, emotionless, as if the moment carried no weight for him. The courtroom erupted. Victims wept, some in relief, others in anguish, knowing that no sentence could undo the damage done. But even as the gavel struck, closing one of the darkest chapters in UK crime history, one chilling truth remained. Police feared there were still hundreds of unidentified victims, men who would never know what had happened to them, men who would never get justice. Sinaga had been caught, but the scars he left behind, those would last forever. Reynard Sinaga was behind bars, but his story, his crimes, had left an indelible mark on Britain. For the survivors, for the legal system, and for society at large, the end of his trial was only the beginning of a much bigger conversation. Victim 4 said, I spent years thinking nothing had happened to me, that my worst night out was just waking up hungover somewhere I didn't recognize. I had no idea my life had been changed forever. Victim 5 stated, the hardest part wasn't just finding out what happened. It was realizing that I had no memory of it at all, that he had complete control over me in those moments. That part still haunts me. Victim 6 said I was ashamed. I didn't want to believe it. I still struggled to say the words out loud, but knowing I wasn't alone, that changed everything. For decades, male victims of sexual assault had remained largely unheard, their experiences often dismissed or overshadowed. But the magnitude of this case forced an uncomfortable truth into the light. Victims of sexual violence weren't just women. Men too were being preyed upon, manipulated, and silenced. This case wasn't just about Sinaga's crimes. It was about rewriting the narrative of who can be a victim and who can be a predator. One of the most disturbing elements of this case was the public perception before it broke. Many still struggle to comprehend that men can be victims of such crimes, which makes it even harder for them to come forward. Sinaga knew this. He weaponized that stigma. He targeted men who would never suspect they could be in danger. And that's what made him so terrifyingly successful. In the wake of Sinaga's conviction, advocacy groups pushed for better education, stronger protections, and more accessible resources for male survivors of sexual assault. But the scars left behind wouldn't heal overnight. For over a decade, Reynhard Sinaga operated unnoticed. But how? How did one man in the center of a bustling city manage to assault hundreds of victims without ever raising suspicion? It's a difficult question because in hindsight, we see all the red flags. But at the time, he was invisible. His method was designed to keep him hidden. He chose victims unlikely to remember or report what happened. He never used violence. No struggle meant no immediate police involvement. He collected trophies but kept them hidden, meticulously organized in a personal archive. His polite academic persona made him seem harmless, the last person anyone would suspect. As police pieced together the full extent of Sinaga's crimes, one chilling truth emerged. The numbers might be even higher than anyone realized. We estimate there may be over 200 victims. But the truth is, we don't know the real number. Many of these men will never come forward. Many may never even realize what happened to them. Hundreds of men, some living normal lives, never questioning the blank spaces in their memory. Others battling silent trauma, unsure of where it even came from. For them, the case is not over. The fight for justice, for healing, for understanding is just beginning. Reynhard Sinaga is locked away, serving a life sentence for his crimes. But the impact of what he did, what he got away with for over a decade, still lingers. His case didn't just expose the terrifying scale of his crimes. It exposed failures, stigmas, questions that society had long ignored. When the full extent of Sinaga's crimes was revealed, it forced authorities to confront an uncomfortable truth. The UK had never dealt with a case like this before, and in many ways it wasn't prepared. The way we handle sexual assault cases, particularly when the victims are men, had to change. Sinaga exposed a gap in how we view these crimes, how we talk about them, and how we support survivors. Stronger protections against drink spiking and predatory behavior in nightlife settings. Increased awareness and resources for male victims of sexual assault. Better forensic tracking for serial offenders who use drugs to incapacitate victims. More open conversations about consent, coercion, and the impact of trauma on memory. For many, Sinaga's case wasn't just about bringing him to justice. It was about making sure something like this never happens again. Male sexual assault has always been underreported. There's this idea that men should be strong, or that they can't be victims. But Sinaga's case proved otherwise. He targeted men because he knew society wouldn't believe them. Many of his victims initially brushed off what happened. They thought they had just had one too many drinks and blacked out. That's why predators like Sinaga thrive. Because victims are often too ashamed or too confused to come forward. Since his conviction, more men have come forward to share their experiences. More cases have been investigated, and more survivors have found the courage to seek justice. We know of at least 200 victims, but the real number? We may never know. For every victim that came forward, there were likely many who never will. Men who will live their entire lives unaware that they were part of Britain's most horrifying criminal case, and that may be the most chilling part of all. Reynhard Sinaga will die in prison. His story is over. But the consequences of what he did? They will never be forgotten. His case will be studied for decades. It will be a warning, a wake-up call. A reminder that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they stand right beside us. But perhaps the most important lesson from this case isn't about Sinaga at all. It's about his victims, the men who stood up, the men who came forward, the men who broke the silence. Because of them, Britain changed. Because of them, more victims will be believed. Because of them, justice was served.